Laravel is on a fast release cadence. Version 9.0 was released just a couple of months ago, and we are now up to version 9.5. So there are, of course, new features that you need to be aware of. I am Jeremy McPeak with Envato Tuts Plus, and I'll show you some of Laravel 9's new features in this video. But first, if you want to create a professional website, then head over to Code Canyon, the marketplace for high-quality JavaScript and PHP components, HTML5 and mobile templates, and so much more. The items at Code Canyon can help you easily add the functionality and eye-popping visuals that you need to meet your business's goals. At Code Canyon, you will find a massive library that contains thousands of JavaScript and PHP components and almost 20,000 HTML and mobile templates. You will definitely find what you are looking for to take your site to the next level. Of course, the first thing that we need to discuss is the PHP requirements for Laravel 9, because Laravel 9 at a minimum requires PHP 8.0. So if you've been holding off on upgrading from 7 to 8, well, now would be a very good time to do that, because otherwise you're not going to be able to use any of the Laravel 9 goodness. And speaking of, let's go ahead and start talking about an improvement to Eloquent, which is a different syntax for defining accessors and mutators. So here I have a model called guitar. It has 3 attributes: make, model, and year. And I've defined an accessor called display name because I want to be able to display all of those attributes without having to type them all out every single time. So this is simply called display name. If we look at the browser, we're going to see that it does indeed work. Now with Laravel 9, we can define this accessor using the attribute class. It is in Illuminate, Database, Eloquent, Casts, and Attribute. And it essentially starts off the same way in that we define a method, but the method name is the attribute name that we want to use. We don't have to prepend it with get or set. We don't have to append attribute to the end of it. It is simply the name of the attribute that we want to use, and then we type in that it is going to return attribute, and then we simply return a new attribute where we can define the getter and the setter. So in this case, if we want to replicate the same functionality as the accessor for display name, we would define a function that is going to provide the value as well as the attributes for this particular model so that we can use those to output our string. And if you want to define a mutator, then you simply use the set, define the function for that. And in this case, we're just going to return the value there. But whenever we view this in the browser, we are going to see the exact same results. It's just that our definition for the display name attribute is just a little bit cleaner. And in version 9.2, there was a static make method that was added to the attribute class. So you don't have to new up the attribute constructor. You can just use the make static method, provide the same information, and of course, you're going to end up with the same information in the browser. So whether if you want to new up the constructor or use the make method, it's completely up to you. I personally like the make method. Just be consistent with whatever you choose to use. Now, of course, Eloquent isn't the only thing to see improvements in Laravel 9. We have some improvements to our controllers, and more specifically, whenever we define the routes for our controllers. Like for example, here is a route for a URL that is going to display the information for an individual customer, but it's more than just the customer. It's more than just the guitars of that customer. We are also going to display an individual guitar for an individual customer. So there is this binding between what is essentially a parent model, which is our customer, and then the child model, which is the guitar. And this was possible, but we had to create a custom key that was used for this route binding to happen. Well, that's not the case anymore. We can simply call a method called scope bindings whenever we define a route. And that is going to give us the same functionality with minimal fuss. And that's always a good thing. And Laravel 9 gives us a new utility to create a group of routes for a particular controller. Now, of course, if you are using resource controllers, that's always been easy to do. But if you don't need the functionality of a resource controller, but you still need to define the routes for a controller, that could always be a little tedious and repetitious. But with Laravel 9, you can use the controller method to specify the controller that you want to use for a group of routes. So you would call the group method that accepts a callback function. And inside of this function, you simply define the routes that you want to group to this controller. So then the URLs essentially stay the same, but all you then have to do is specify the method on that controller that is going to handle that URL. So not only does this make defining routes a little bit easier to type, but it also groups the routes together, which I guess you can make the argument that they were grouped together anyway, at least as long as you did that yourself. But now we have a mechanism built into the framework that literally groups routes together. And I like that. Now, we're not done talking about routing because Laravel 9 supports the use of enums in your route URLs. And I love enums because it allows us, well, essentially type safety when working with constant values. So let's say that we want to have a route so that we can display the information about the different guitar companies. So the URL would look something like this, where we would have companies, and then we would have something that would give us the individual company itself. Well, all we have to do is essentially treat this like any other kind of model class, so that we will type hint using our guitar company's enum, and then Laravel is going to automatically match that value and give us the appropriate case from that enum. So if we wanted to view that value, then we could easily do that. Now, of course, remember that URLs are strings. So you typically want to use a string-backed enum if you're going to use this feature. But this is so awesome. So if we wanted to take a look at this in action, we can go to companies, we can go to PRS, and we're going to see PRS as the value. If we go to Fender, we will see Fender. And of course, if we type Gibson, then we're going to see Gibson there as well. But what if we try for a case that doesn't exist, like Ibanez? 404 not found. That's what I would expect. And since we are talking about enums, this is a perfect opportunity to talk about how Eloquent can cast an attribute value into an enum. Now, there are a few things that you need to be aware of in order to use this feature. First of all, you have to be using PHP 8.1. Second, your enums have to have a backing value, which makes perfect sense because if you're going to cast an attribute value to an enum, there has to be some kind of matching value there. So your enums have to be backed by a string or an integer. And then finally, the values in the enums have to exactly match the values in the database. It is case sensitive, and we will see that here in a moment. But let's first of all set up the guitar model so that it will cast the make attribute into the guitar company's enum. To do this, we use the protected casts property array, and then we basically specify the attribute that we want to cast, and then the enum that we want to cast it into. And that's basically it. It's very straightforward to set this up. So let's go to our routes so that we can set up a quick little route to demonstrate this. We're going to select a particular guitar and then compare its make value to our guitar company's enum. And let's just output the result of that comparison. So we would use our attribute like we normally would, and we compare that with one of the cases from our guitar company's enum. In this case, let's use PRS. So let's go to the browser, let's refresh the page here, and we're going to see an error. We can see that the error is that PRS in all uppercase is not a valid backing value for enum guitar companies. We will talk about that here in a moment, but since we are getting an error, we might as well look at the new error page that comes with Laravel 9. Yes, it has been updated, and it gives you all of the information that you need about the error that took place. But let's get back to the error at hand, that PRS is not a valid backing value. Well, that's because in the database, PRS is in all uppercase, whereas if we look at the enum, it is in all lowercase. So what I need to do here is either update the database, which I definitely don't want to do. Instead, I'll just update the code. So PRS is in all uppercase. Fender and Gibson begin with an uppercase letter. So by fixing that, we should be able to go back to the browser and we see the value of 1. So that comparison is of course true. If we look at any of the other guitars, which are not made by PRS, then we don't see anything, which of course indicates that the comparison resulted in a false value. But what is this going to do to our display name attribute? Well, it's not going to do anything, because if we take a look at that, we're going to see the same result that we had before, where we have the year, the make, which is now the guitar company's enum, and then the model of the guitar. Now, when it comes to outputting the values, I've just been returning simple string values or Boolean values. But what if we want something that is kind of like a view, but we don't necessarily want to create an entire view? Well, we can use an inline blade template. And we do this by using the blade facade, and it has a render method so that we can provide a simple template. So let's have the text of display name and then a template variable called simply display name. And then we can provide the data to that template. So in this case, we will use the display name, and let's go back to the browser, refresh, and we should see our new content. Now, to wrap things up, we have a few helper functions. Some of them are for strings. Like, for example, if we wanted to wrap a particular string, then we can easily do that by using the wrap method. Simply pass in the string that you want to use to wrap around the provided value, and that's it. There's also an append method so that you can append a string to an existing string. And then finally, we have a helper function for redirecting to a given route. It's called toRoute, and you specify the route that you want to redirect to, and then you can supply any information necessary for that route. So in this case, if we wanted to go to an individual guitars page, then we would need to supply that information as well. And if you want to be really, really specific, you can supply the response code as well as any headers to go with the response. Now, of course, there are other new features in Laravel 9. The ones that I covered in this video are those that I personally find to improve my experience on a regular basis. But be sure to check out Laravel 9's release notes for information on the other features, such as support for Symfony Mailer, Fly System 3, full text indexes, a database engine called Scout for providing search capabilities, and quite a few other features. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it and want to see more, then be sure to subscribe to the Envato Tuts Plus YouTube channel. And of course, if you want to learn more, be sure to check out the other fantastic videos and tutorials that Envato Tuts Plus has to offer. I am Jeremy, and I will see you next time.